Welcome everyone to our Speaker Bureau webinar series about a topic today that is near and dear to my heart. For anyone who knows me, I talk about this quite often, which is the concept of sovereignty and instant and inclusive payment systems. And so what is the importance of sovereignty? What are the risks of not having sovereignty? And I think because a lot of us in our community tend to believe in the concept of sovereignty and the importance of it, I'd like to get into some of the nuances of some of our, what are some of the critical areas where we want to work on to make sure that countries have sovereignty. So the way today is going to go is first I'm going to go through a slide deck, which unfortunately is not mine. We had a speaker who unfortunately for reasons outside of his control could not join today. And so I'm going to go through his slides to kind of give an intro to the conversation, but we're going to focus much more on the panelist conversations, but then also on having some Q&A at the end. So please use the question and answer button to ask questions. You can start asking questions as of now, and then we will, and then at the end of it, we'll address all of the questions with the panel. All right. Okay, with that, Peter. All right. Okay, and then so I'll go through these slides relatively quickly, and then again, looking forward to having an engaging session after this. So first, we have a problem. What is the problem we're trying to talk about when we talk about digital sovereignty? And one is that data is produced and stored and processed in one country that's governed by the laws of that country. So we can think about when we talk about data sovereignty, we're saying that even if the data belongs to the country or came from a different country, it's actually not bound by the laws of that country. It's bound by the laws of where it's being stored or processed, or potentially even by the company, the laws of where the company is registered that owns the servers where it's being processed, which creates a big challenge. And so data processed in country A but localized in country B might be subject to either both or none of the laws. And so it becomes very confusing of how those laws are applied. And honestly, it's just a challenge I think we've actually addressed yet. And so then obviously we're not talking about two countries, and those of us who deal with interoperability know that it's not about bilateral conversations, it's about multilateral conversations. And so how do we deal with that when we're dealing with not just 2 or 3 countries, but 190? Next slide. I'm definitely not an expert in all of this, but I would say that every country is developing different laws on this. And I think that's quite important that those that work on policy start thinking about that and how that works. But again, most of these are around the concept of data sovereignty. So the one thing I would say on that is anytime anyone's talking about legislative developments of the concept of sovereignty and digital sovereignty, it's exclusively focused on data sovereignty and countries' ability to protect the rights of their citizens, which, not to take away how important it is, but I think we're talking about something slightly different. Next slide. Okay, so sovereignty and why it matters. And there's, again, the difference between data sovereignty and technology sovereignty. And what we're talking about here is primarily technology sovereignty, which is where the technology is deployed. Is it deployed on-prem in the country? Is it deployed on a data center in the country? Who owns that data center? Who operates that technology? And how technology complies to laws and local laws. But I think it's also about who owns the technology. And who has the ability to change that technology, who has the ability to open up that technology. So who has complete control over that technology, I think is incredibly important. Next slide. Okay. And this is going to start becoming even more important when we start working on some of the projects that we're working on within the Mojaloop community, which are a lot of cross-border trade, because then we're actually contributing to some of the movement of data across regions. And that's where data sovereignty is going to become something we need to be considering in the Mojaloop community, because yeah, it's very difficult to have trade across countries, and especially having transactions across countries, which require the movement of information about citizens, if the laws prohibit that. And so the law has to be conducive to that type of cross-border trade while still protecting citizens. The other thing that can be difficult is if a country wants to trade with other partners, if it has any technology or digital dependencies on one country, it might find it difficult to trade with countries that might have a different relationship with that country. And that's where we have to deal with with the issues of things like sanctions or things like geopolitics of digital sovereignty. And yeah, next slide. Okay, so inclusivity means converting digital sovereignty barriers into opportunities. I'd like to focus on the second one there, to keep the unit transaction costs down. We have an opportunity, and that opportunity is again, making these systems responsive to and controlled locally allows for costs to come down, because we're not depending on service providers that might be in a different country using a different currency. The one thing I do always like to talk about with costs, again, anyone who's ever talked to me, is that costs are not always monetary costs. Costs are sometimes political costs, they're sometimes relationship costs, they're sometimes service quality costs. So when we think about costs, we have to remember it is not only about the actual monetary costs. As well as, and then last one there on cybersecurity threats. Again, we have to be thinking about cybersecurity threats, which are direct, but then also thinking about what is a country's ability to affect, for example, Microsoft's cybersecurity stance. Very little. So if there's a dependency on a foreign country, the sovereign country might not have an ability to influence any type of repercussions on a company that puts its country and its data and its citizens at risk. Next slide. So I think that technology user needs and scheme market trends shape inclusive payment systems. I think we all agree with that. I don't think anyone would be in the Mojaloop community if we didn't agree with that. And those market trends and the needs of the end users are driven domestically. And the inability of a country to respond to those market trends because of some type of lack of control that they have from not having digital sovereignty can have massive repercussions, because you end up trying to offer your citizens a technology or an end user experience that was designed for different countries. And I think there are some examples of where that has worked quite well, but also examples of where it has not worked quite well. And I think that's where the interesting conversation for us is going to be. All right, next slide. Okay. So I know I went through those relatively quickly, but I would like to get to the discussion, and I also want to make sure that we leave time for the Q&A. I saw a hand up earlier, but I do want to say we will be addressing questions at the end of the panel, but I will make sure that there's some time for that. At this point, I'd like to ask the panelists to open up their video, and we can stop sharing the slides. Okay. All right, so we actually have 4 panelists today, but one of them, we're having some technical problems on our side getting her in. But hopefully before the end of the panel, she'll be joining us. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Robert Karanja. Robert currently serves as the Senior Director at Co-Develop, where he leads the firm's strategic investments and partnerships in Africa, leveraging on his experience in networks on the continent. experience and networks in the continent. And he's currently working to advocate for the development of credible African-led, African-owned stack of digital public infrastructure assets that will change the trajectory of the continent. I'm currently deeply engaged with the governments of Zambia, Uganda, Nigeria, and others to provide relevant digital advisory and teams to each of those respective governments. And I can say that having worked with Robert over the past year or so, since we've really gotten deep into the DPI space at Mojaloop, that's not lip service. He is the biggest advocate for making sure that these are African-led, African-owned digital stacks. And we very much appreciate his partnership on this and look forward to seeing his leadership across the continent over the next couple of decades, long after a lot of us are not doing it anymore. So very honored to have you here. I'll go ahead and introduce her because hopefully she'll be joining in a minute, which is Sharon Umanyana. She is the technical project manager for RISA, the Rwandan Information Society Agency. So she's leading the implementation of the Mojaloop project for the Rwandan government side. And she also is leading the efforts to develop a digital public infrastructure center that will not only integrate different Rwandan DPIs, but also share their experiences to the wider African market. So we are very thrilled to have both Robert and Sharon as our partners on this DPI journey in the Mojaloop community. I think that it will be very exciting to see where DPI goes. I think a lot of us who are passionate about the DPI concept have noted that there are definitely a few particular countries whose narrative is the one driving it. And it will be very exciting to see to make sure that narrative becomes a little bit more diverse. And we have more countries who are talking about their DPI narrative. And next we have Ni A, who is the co-founder and the CEO of INFITX, which is a fintech company based in Singapore. They focus on creating data-driven solutions to help financial institutions manage payments, handle data efficiently, and reduce risks. And INFITX has been one of the early adopters of Mojaloop. We've been working with them. They've been a member of the very, very active member of the community for the past, I think, 4 years now, at least. And also something a lot of you don't know about Ni is both an avid skydiver and scuba diver. So if you ever have a chance to talk to him, please ask him about the funny story where he actually mixed up the gear and brought his scuba gear instead of his parachute. It didn't end well. Next, we have Dr. Warren Carew. He has, since his involvement with inventing payment systems, the function of which is now known as M-Pesa, he's been an advocate for equitable and inclusive financial systems. He's currently the co-founder and CEO of the global fintech company INFITX that has been supporting the evolution and adoption of Mojaloop interoperable payment systems, particularly across Africa. Warren has been involved in Mojaloop as a key architect and a key driver of the design since the very beginning, I would say. Also very crucial to the direction that it's going. So very excited to have both the leaders of INFITX and INFITX who are key community members here. With that, I'd like to jump in directly and lead it off with Robert. I know I jumped through those slides faster than we had anticipated. So can you maybe respond to what are some of your key thoughts on the definition of digital sovereignty, and especially in the context of this mixing up of digital sovereignty and data sovereignty?
Thanks, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be here. I was thinking about the two different definitions that you shared, and I think from where I sit, I've seen data protection offices kind of interplay between the two of them, right? In terms of what reach do data protection authorities on the continent have when it comes to digital sovereignty, and what are the issues that they should be focused on, and which issues should they be kind of keeping their hands off. But I get the sense that for the more progressive data protection officers across the continent, there is an element of capacity building that's happening, and kind of to build knowledge and capacity around what they should actually be looking out for and letting the market play in a space that, you know, that's really not the field that they should be focusing on. I've seen that in Kenya. I've seen that in Nigeria. I think Ghana to a certain extent. I haven't followed South Africa too closely, but those three markets I have followed closely and seen that there's an element of knowledge building, capacity building that's enabling them to build their skills around the areas that they should actually be governing while letting the market play freely on the areas that they should not be governing. So when I think about tech sovereignty, you know, where does tech get deployed? Who's operating the tech and who owns it? I feel there's a gap to a certain extent in terms of both what the technology companies want to do and what governments through their data protection offices are trying to govern, in a sense that, you know, how much of it should be local, what should be the reach of a foreign-owned company, and also, are there any rights that are being infringed, say by or that are being lost by enabling competition or foreign-owned competition to operate within a certain jurisdiction? And so I think it's an ongoing conversation. Definitely not. It's very far from being perfect. But I do get the sense, and I've seen this with, and sorry, Steve, I'll use probably a poor example, but I've seen this with Meta, for example, you know, large companies such as Meta and Google, where they actually have government and public policy folks within the business who then engage directly with governments and data protection offices to ensure that they're not only educating them and building their knowledge around what is possible and what is not possible, but they're also looking out for the interests of the multinational businesses as they operate in different jurisdictions. And so I've seen that happening. But again, you do need to have deep pockets to do that, and not every business can do that. But Meta and Google have been particularly good at being able to take care of that side of the business. And I think it's a learning experience, but cross-pollination, sharing of information across both the tech companies and governments, I think will help us get to a better space over the next few years or so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. And there's about 5 things you said I want to go back to, but I want to get to everyone else. And I've just seen that Sharon has joined. Thank you very much, Sharon. You missed your introduction. I promise it was accurate. You'll have to watch the recording. But I'll give you a chance to get settled, and I'll call on Warren next. Warren, any reactions to anything in that slide deck that you saw that you'd like to call out, or as important, or say, okay, well, this is actually a different way we should be thinking about this problem?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you to everyone for allowing us to participate. Yeah, I think that the points, especially as Robert was going towards, it's the collaboration between government and technology, and really the invention of technology. Sovereignty, when we speak about it, it's people looking to be able to control the lives of their citizens, or not be held at ransom, more importantly, and their citizens being held at ransom. And in the Mojaloop sense, in the payment sense, you know, that can have a very real impact in economies that are going cash free. And we know that a lot of African states have said that's a stated objective. We want to be cash free. But that also means they need to be able to ensure that independence to operate a cash free economy. And when I use the word economy, you know, people might think about big companies and banks, but it's the people on the ground. It's you know, buying bread for dinner tonight is the thing you have to make sure you have resilience over. So I think being sensitive to that, and that kind of sovereignty that empowers the local people, that means that a government can't reach across from one continent to another. These are key things, and I think at the forefront of a lot of the concerns in this space. And as we look at it, we see the general digital public goods and digital public infrastructure initiatives as cornerstones to combining both the scale of technology enhancements, but giving the control and ownership ultimately to the users who are going to depend on those. That does mean taking responsibility, though. So I think that's always an interesting balance.
I think that the responsibility point is a great one. I think that would be great if we came back to it. Maybe that's a key call out that was not in that slide, is that is something that does come in. And I think for a lot of us who are working in this space in the Mojaloop world, I think we don't get a sense of the lack of desire for responsibility from the individuals we deal with, but very often bureaucratic structures may not be as well suited for it. And I think that's where the obstacles that we've seen come into. So Nia, I'd like to give you the same question. Any thoughts or feedback after watching that presentation of things you'd like to really highlight or change the direction of?
Thanks, Steve. Robert and Warren, cover a lot of things that were on my mind as well. So I think they are on point. I will start with one word that Warren mentioned at the end, right, which is balance. I think that is going to be also one thing that we will need to consider very carefully, right, in this aspect. And I will give you an example. One thing that stood out right from the slide and the discussions, that the data sovereignty and the technology sovereignty, right? These are very important, but also these are the complex and the important topics, right, for not just the regulators but also the private sector, right, to be a part of in the discussing on how to implement that. By balance, what I meant is that, okay, so when we talk about where the data is produced, originated, stored, and how they are processed, right, we really want to make sure that we give the local authorities the ability to manage and control, where data is the appropriately the process, right, to have the framework that has the national control. But at the same time, we want to make sure that these local financial institutions can be a part of the global financial community. Right? So what does it mean? Right? So you can have the local control, but have the global standards like ISO 20022 and other standards adopted, so that there is the ability for all the financial institutions in the country to communicate and interact with other financial institutions in other parts of the world. I think that is going to be a balance that we will always need to look at, because the sovereignty does not mean protectionism, that that you are not dealing with any other players outside of the border of your country. We are in this globalized world, right? So we need to do that. When it comes to the technology sovereignty, very similar point, right? You want the countries to have the control over their infrastructure, right? Or where it operates and who is operating that, how it is deployed, and whether it is complying with the local laws, right? So you want to have this ability and this control, but at the same time, we need to find a balance between not having to restart everything from the scratch, and that, right, you are not introducing mission critical systems and the payment rails and many important public infrastructure in a suboptimal infrastructure, right, as a foundation, right? So you also want to look at the optimized cloud infrastructure and where it can be a part of the solution as well. In some countries, right, where there is the cloud infrastructure available in their country, I think there's an easier ability to manage that, right? But in some other countries where it is not available, I think it should be a look at and see what are the mission critical pieces that should stay in the country, and what are the pieces that could potentially be in an environment where it can be it can provide a more optimize performance. I think that this is the balance that we need to look at.
Thanks, Dean. I think you brought up a great point. So things like when you have that not starting from scratch, and whether you're talking about not starting from scratch, obviously this is a Mojaloop webinar, so we all think of Mojaloop as a great example of not starting from scratch. You also brought up another one, which is ISO 20022, and one of the things we need to also remember is that sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean because big government X told me I have to do this. I mean, the control and governance is nuanced. So ISO 20022, I mean, we're about to hear from Sharon, but I mean, does Rwanda have an ability to actually influence the standard that is ISO 20022, or are they being forced to to adopt a standard that they can't influence? Now, I'm not actually saying one way or another, but I think the obvious answer is not a lot, but maybe better ability to influence ISO 20022 than ability to influence EMVCO as a standard, let's say. But let's say not a huge difference. So having global standards is one thing, but also we need to remember that there are certain power structures are not always state actors. Sometimes they're non-state actors, and organizations that control standards like ISO 20022 in our world are considered pretty powerful non-state actors. So it is also important to remember that, especially for us, in my opinion, the Mojaloop community, to remember that it doesn't do us any good if the people controlling the direction of Mojaloop are not the people using Mojaloop. And I think that's the point I wanted to get to with that. So that just because something is an open standard doesn't mean it's truly sovereign. But again, just to add on, I couldn't help but add on to that point you said. Thank you very much, Nee. So with that, I want to move on to Sharon and hear your thoughts. I mean, I think you missed the presentation at the beginning, but I think that's fine. You can. What we want to hear from you is from the Rwanda perspective, what is the definition of digital sovereignty? And I think because, in particular, most people know that Rwanda has invested decades now in preparing for having digital sovereignty, with education of an entire generation of people to do that. There was a very specific drive. And so I think that's definitely put Rwanda in a different place than a lot of countries. So with that, I would love to hear you and your place in leading the DPI initiatives in the country of how does Rwanda think about digital sovereignty?
Thank you very much, Steve. And I did catch up a bit with your presentation. Apologies for catching in late. I just had some issues joining. But yeah, I think in the context of Rwanda, as you mentioned, we have, at least for the last 20 years, spent time building infrastructure, trying to analyze what infrastructures we need, be specifically digital. And to us, that came with, creating laws around that. If we're creating a structure, how do we protect the consumer? How do we ensure security? How do we ensure that we are mitigating cybersecurity attacks? So around those 20 years, then later other initiatives have come in where we then learned that there are other countries who are actually who have already implemented some of the infrastructures we're looking for. For example, Mojaloop in this case, instead of us reinventing the wheel, creating a whole new switch, how can we tap into a digital public good that is already in place and build components around that speak to our customization. So to us then, to answer your question, digital sovereignty to us means how do we make sure that we are preserving what we've built over the 20 years and ensure that we are owning what we've built, but we are equally owning what we're also adopting from other markets or what other digital public infrastructures or goods that are out there. So we want to be able to protect these infrastructures, but as well have the ability to act independently in the digital sphere. So, but again, digital technologies become very pervasive in a sense that we need to have the ability to control and protect our digital assets, but also mainly from cyber attacks, the data protection I've been talking about, but also making sure that all the digital infrastructures that we are acquiring are also becoming paramount for the economy, for the economic, social, and political stability. So that's how we look at it from the context of Rwanda. And I think I think we may talk about it later on how Rwanda has done that. But yeah, in a general sense, that's how we look at it from Rwanda. Thank you, Steve. Thank
you, Sharon. And Robert, I think we'll come back to you, but I want to. There's a comment that I want to on ISO 22, which is a great one. I think I definitely didn't want to come out negative about 2022. It's an open standard. We love that, and we love that anyone can contribute. But it leads into the next question, which is I really wanted to make the point that when we think about lack of sovereignty, what we often think about is big countries like is country X beholden to maintaining their relationship with the US government or the Chinese government or the Indian government, whereas there are other actors out there that it also has to have relationships with and also has to engage with. And whether it is an ISO body or the main organizations that control it, or entities like the World Bank or the Gates Foundation or the Mojaloop Foundation. And so I'd like to hear Robert, so because it's not just about the technology, it's also the people who fund it or the influencers of it. And so in that, you work with a number of countries, Robert, on digital public infrastructure. We think it's important. How important do the governments that you're working with think it is?
Steve, great question. And I think one of the big issues or big challenges or roadblocks that we find around discussions to do with open source is the question on where will the data be stored. Governments struggle with cloud infrastructure, right? I'm just thinking about something Kenya has recently done. For those of you who are familiar with Naivasha out in the Rift Valley, Kenya has just signed an agreement to set up an in-country physical data center in Naivasha. And there are two sides to that coin, because there are arguments that are going to come in from a climate change perspective, right? On the maintenance and running a physical data center in Naivasha. And could we have been able to deploy this much faster on the cloud and still maintain an element of sovereignty in terms of ownership and managing how that data is accessed? And so I don't have the right answer to that, but one of the arguments or the pushbacks that I do see on the benefits of open source technology is, where will our data be stored and who will have access to that data? And that question comes up often. I was also thinking about, the fact that there's a lot of time, energy, and resources that's being spent around, kind of digital sovereignty in country A. Country B is doing the same thing without speaking to country A. Country C is doing the same thing, and they have no idea what B and A are doing, and it goes on and on and on. But one of the big platforms that many countries on the African continent are transitioning to is trying to promote interregional and intercountry trade via the CFTA. This will involve a fair amount of data processing going across borders. It may even involve data moving across several borders at the same time for transactions to be complete. So we almost do need to have harmonized platform or harmonized structure in terms of how that data will be managed, processed, and also even owned, and who will have access to it and for how long. Because the amount of time, energy, and resources that's going into just the data sovereignty of one country may also distract us from the fact that for the Continental Free Trade Agreement or Continental Free Trade Area to actually become a reality, there will need to be cross-border regional conversations, even across the different. I noticed on the presentation, you know, we talked about SADC, we talked about the West African Monetary Union, we talked about the EAC, we talked about COMESA, and there's also cross-pollination of countries across each one of those regional bodies, right? If I look at Tanzania, for example, Tanzania sits in 3 of those regional bodies. Burundi is in 2. DRC is in 2 of them, SADC and EAC. And so to what extent are these regional bodies or regional platforms speaking to one another? And the data conversation will become more of a real issue as we move towards actualizing greater trade between countries, cross-border trade across the continental free trade area, let alone even the fact that several countries are signing, for example, the EAC is signing agreements with the EU, right, on trade. And then at the same time, you have bilateral agreements between country A and country A in Africa or within the EAC and country B within the EU. So which of those, what kind of protocols are in place to ensure that, you know, data exchange, data laws are still observed, and countries do still feel that they maintain a certain element of digital sovereignty, but are still able to facilitate cross-border trade, or in Mojaloop's case, Steve, cross-border payments without too much of a hurdle. Yeah.
Robert, I'd say, I mean, I think that probably resonated with a few of the people in our community, and I would say that if you have some extra time in your busy schedule, we have something called our cross-border workstream. And I think everyone working on that work stream would love your input, because that is exactly what one of the things that they're trying to solve is most of the countries that we would look at who might want to adopt Mojaloop, they do have to comply to these different standards of 2 or 3 or and you're just talking about the regional trade, like you said. Then you're talking about even outside the continent or outside of their regions, the different standards that are required for a country to be able to comply with and transact with are pretty impressive. So we are trying to turn that work stream into an area where those conversations can happen. So would love your input, or anyone else who that resonated with. Please join the cross-border work stream in the Mojaloop community. Because we are running a little low on time, I'd like to go to Nii, if you don't mind, Nii. We are focused quite a bit on what this means for sovereignty in Africa. Coming from Asia and with your company based in Singapore, what do you think? Is this something that is a topic that is considered in Southeast Asia, and is it considered? I know you work also in Africa. Is the discussion around sovereignty different in Southeast Asia versus in Africa?
I think the conversations that are happening, right? I'm not privy to of course many of the conversations, right, between the regulators, but from what we have seen and what we have experienced and the presentations then talks that we have had, the similar concerns and similar questions are on a lot of regulators' minds, and a lot of governments are trying to implement and are trying to they replicate the success stories of some of the models, right, that have been considered successful in creating digital public infrastructure that help in terms of the financial inclusion in a tremendous scale. We're looking at China, we're looking at the India, the Brazil, for example. I think those have sparked, right, a lot of the conversations around the digital sovereignty and how these digital infrastructure, public infrastructure, can be implemented in a lot of the governments, including Southeast Asia and also in Africa, where we have had many of those conversations. Right? I think that conversation is very, very alive and very similar. that, as Robert said, I'm not sure how much, of the conversations among themselves is there, and whether there is the synergy on like taking all these initiatives forward. Right? So I think that can always be improved in my opinion. Right. One thing that Robert said is something that we're also seeing. When we talk about the digital sovereignty, right, I think there's like one aspect of that, right, where we would like the countries, or the countries would like to have the data sovereignty and digital sovereignty, where they can control the data and technology, right, much more closely. But at the same time, we are seeing increase in cross-border trade, and also increase in financial inclusion by using data technology. There's a increase in financial inclusion, and there's always the wish to increase even more, right? And with that, I think the interoperability and the standards, right, between those the markets and the regions and the countries will have to be in place. So digital sovereignty on one side, interoperability, and the standards on the other side is a balance that we will need to always find.
And yeah, that's a great point of balance, because very often we can all think of examples both globally and in each one of our countries where the interoperability is defined as, well, I'm the biggest person, I'm the biggest organization. Interoperability means you connect to me. And you get interoperability through monopoly rather than interoperability through collaboration. So before we move on to the next one, Warren, you're going to come next, but I just want to remind everyone in the audience that there's a Q&A button. We're not going to go to live questions, so please write your questions in. We'll keep talking until I see questions, but we can start opening up for you to ask questions now, if you have questions for these panelists, or if you have thoughts on sovereignty that you'd like to share with everyone. So Warren, next I'd like to talk to you. So INFITX is a global company, and we're here saying, no, governments should be, and countries should be independent of global fintech companies and have sovereignty from global fintech companies. How do you, as a global company, deal with the fact that you promote sovereignty, but you are a foreign company that needs to make money? How do you balance that?
Yeah, there's a good question, Steve. I think that it is vital that we will succeed because of economies of scale in many regards. And even what Nii was just saying about how do governments leverage the scale of cloud providers in a safe and secure way? How do we make sure that there are solutions that are going to meet the needs of a country without having to start from those first principles? We've all agreed those are sensible things to have. Well, we get those things to scale up and actually deliver by having some words you may have heard me say before, which is a sustainable ecosystem. And that means that actually people have to not be greedy, whether they're greedy, and yeah, again, it's not about money, it's about knowledge, sharing those things. We've spoken about how we have country A and B and C doing the same thing and not sharing it enough. So for us, the way we do this is we support the open source community, we support the Mojaloop Foundation, we support enabling partners in each of those countries. We work with we try and make sure every engagement we have, we're walking away from a competent team that is able to understand the technology they've adopted, they've been able to build on it, they're able to contribute on that. And we've been able to do that successfully in many cases now. And that gives the scale for this, because actually, Mojaloop as a technology provides the risk management that we need. I'm sorry, I'm going a little off piece here now, but I wanted to get back to the idea that with Mojaloop, what we're doing is we're impedance matching the big players, the small players, the little countries, everybody, how we can allow them to play. And we have a solution here that when people adopt, they can allow all those parties to interact. And we were mentioning now about cross-border and the sharing of data. Mojaloop took the approach very early on to say, we are not going to take the default of say, share all the data you possibly can have, which is why ISO and things like that have historically not been fit for purpose in this space. But we've said, just share enough data to do the job. You're not trying to mine the citizens of a country because you need to do a transaction, right? So now we're starting from a slightly different point. We do need to make sure we have counterterrorism measures. We do have security things in place, but we're starting not from the position of, well, I've told you about the entire life history, and now, try and hold that back. We're rather saying to people, let's start sharing the minimum amount of data and figure out what we actually need to do the job. And that makes us find the balance between the risk mitigations versus the inappropriate data sharing of transactions and citizen information across boundaries. Yeah.
Warren, I'm going to cut you off because we're going to get a few minutes left. Wrap it up in a minute, or are you good?
Well,
we got a couple questions.
I'll leave it there for a moment.
Okay, perfect. I do want to say to everyone, if you Warren said a word impedance matching or 2 words impedance matching, please Google it if you didn't understand. Because if you want to have a conversation with Warren, he loves to talk about impedance matching. And Dr. Warren Carew, our electrical engineer. So Robert, there's a question in the chat. Is sovereignty an important factor for investment decisions with co-develop? And to the extent that you can talk about how decisions are made within co-develop.
Thanks, Steve. The gentleman asking the question is a very good friend of mine, so I'll greet him. Malcolm Efter Ibrahim. So sovereignty by extension will be a consideration because co-develop funds and supports open source deployments. Right. So with the assumption that open source deployments promote sovereignty, then my answer would be yes. Right. So co-develop does not fund, or has not and does not fund, proprietary solutions to date. So we support open source deployments across, whether it's a data exchange, payments, or ID. And so my answer would be yes, because by extension, open source deployments do support sovereignty of nations to be able to manage data sovereignty or digital sovereignty from their perspective. Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's excellent to hear, Robert. And I hope that other funders of projects have similar investment strategies. I know that they don't. So we're very excited that co-develop is leading the way in that. The next question is somewhat related, though. It would be good to hear speak about government procurement and open source platforms. For a long time, government procurement processes really do not favor open source platforms. How is this being overcome? And is the sovereignty argument a bit beneficial here, or not really? And I think me, Warren, and I have all been on one side of that discussion, and I think we probably have our biases. But I'd like to have Sharon and Robert try to answer that question. Sharon, do you have any thoughts on any thoughts on government procurement and open source, and are we moving in the right direction? Have we moved far enough? And if you can only speak from the Rwanda perspective, then that's great.
Great, thank you, Steve. Yes, so speaking from the Rwanda perspective, the procurement goes through government, at least as of now, goes through the Rwanda Information Society, which is under the Ministry of ICT. And most of the negotiations are done could be done by the ministry itself, but implemented in RISA. RISA also has done negotiations here. So I'll just speak about Mojaloop to just give a live example of how the procurement process goes. So we do first look at key things that have been mentioned on this, mostly by my fellow panelists. Most of the things we're looking at is the data protection. Is it abiding by our law? Then we're also going to look at regulatory frameworks. Do they speak to what we have? Are we in alignment in that sense? Where then we do carry out, audit checks, compliance checks to make sure that we are in alignment. Then the other part that we really look at is capacity building and knowledge transfer. Is this digital public infrastructure going to be able to provide that? But we also really are keen on investing in local talent. So in the case of Mojaloop, what we did was, discuss all these points. And then Mojaloop has also a community. The Mojaloop community has members from Rwanda, and the Mojaloop, one of the community members is the one implementing the switch on Mojaloop in Rwanda. So those are the key things that we look at. And in terms of resources, onboarding people, because there are a couple of aspects. There's the technology part on the procurement bit. There's the human resource. I think those are the two main ones. And then perhaps the infrastructure, because Rwanda is keen on hosting on-premise, right? So those are the main three things that we did talk about. And then we do have an agreement in place, and then either partner with, because Mojaloop does not manage any funds. So in cases of fund management, we partner with AfricaNenda to do that. So I hope I answered the question, but that's just an overview of how we've done it, and quite similar to some stories I've heard in other countries in Africa specifically as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. And I would say that we've had very different stories in Africa, than different from the ones we've had in Rwanda, I would say, but and not shouldn't just say Africa, but all over the world. Robert, do you have any thoughts on that question, on where we stand with government procurement discussions?
I think I'll yield my response to Sharon's response, which covered a large chunk of how government would behave. But I think just to add that I think Rwanda has done an amazing job, probably more so than many other countries in the region, in terms of also building their knowledge and capacity from a procurement perspective on understanding what open source means vis-a-vis proprietary solutions, right? Because most government agencies are structured to think and respond to proprietary solutions. So when they have to think through actually vetting and being able to score an open source solution, I think it takes a different hat of thinking to be able to understand what it is that you're referring to. But Steve, I think the narrative is changing, because I have seen procurement agencies in the region. Rwanda is a great example. I believe Burundi and also COMESA start thinking through preparing an RFP that's geared towards an open source response. That has never happened before, right? And I think because that narrative is changing, government procurement agencies are becoming more curious and more interested in understanding how open source works. What perhaps is a question that remains unanswered is, what is the cybersecurity threat around actually vetting and being able to understand what open source means to them? And I think once procurement authorities or procurement agencies can understand that, and again, the open source platforms are able to explain it in a very simple narrative, then I think the bridge will be complete. So I expect that we'll start seeing a lot more RFPs going out across different platforms that are geared towards open source platforms vis-a-vis proprietary solutions. I was recently speaking to a switch or hub operator in one of the countries in the region, who was telling me that it's taken them very often, well over a year, for a change request to be responded to. That's unacceptable. And if people understand that aspect, that the market has even gone far beyond the request that you had 12 months ago, right? Or they had to cobble up some sort of response. The change request has still not been responded to months later. Still going to cost you money when they do respond. Business working around proprietary solutions vis-a-vis an open source solution that they themselves and together with system integrators can actually be able to fix very quickly.
Awesome, Robert. For saying you were going to leverage on Sharon, I think you gave a pretty comprehensive answer for that one. So thank you very much. And we're out of time, and I think that was actually, so it was an anonymous person who asked that question, and I think you asked probably the best question. I'm ashamed that I didn't ask that question within the panel. And I think one of the key parts of that question was, is the sovereignty angle a good way to finalize those changes? And I think the answer was yes. And I think we'd all agree with that. But then it's not just sovereignty; it's also the concept of the development of local talent, and not just and the ability to respond to the market are some of the biggest drivers that we're seeing of countries, of champions within countries saying, we need to change the way this procurement's going to be done. But I would say that is still remains the biggest hurdle. But Robert brought up a great point. Now that we have procurement processes in place from Rwanda and from COMESA that explicitly show how it's done, I think we will be in much better shape going forward, because that's the other thing with procurement people. They just like to see how it's been done before. And so we have that under our belt. So thank you both for those comprehensive answers. I think that was perfect and perfect way to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone on this panel. I wish we had 2 hours to talk about this, but unfortunately we don't. So Sharon, Robert, Nee, Warren, thank you so much for taking your time, and the people asking the questions. And I look forward to continuing this conversation online in 3 weeks for the next convening, and then in person in November. Everyone start booking your tickets. I think we are confirmed for Kigali for that. And let's make sure this is part of let's make sure this is part of the conversation we have going forward in the community. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.